It's probably safe to say that Peter Dutton's interview on ABC 7:30 was a little polarising. And reading comments online, it seems to have been a fairly good case study of how things can be viewed radically differently, depending on the political goggles people are wearing. In my view, it was an interesting interview insofar as that it revealed how little substance there is behind Peter Dutton. Plenty of rhetoric, but not much else. Dutton regularly dipped into the Donald Trump playbook, and while host Sarah Ferguson attempted to correct his untruths, she had mixed success. But to be fair, fact-checking in real time is not an easy task. So let's take a look. Ferguson's opener went pretty hard.
Was it humiliating for you to have to stand up and support Labor's changes to the tax cuts?
She then outlines a basic truth.
You're the ones waving this through. You said that backing the tax cut is to support families who need help now. That sounds like the Leader of the Opposition describing good policy.
It does. If the Coalition truly believed that their version of the Stage 3 tax cuts were better for the country than Labor's proposed changes, they'd have stuck to their guns. But they didn't. They folded. Why? Because voting against changes that will leave an estimated 85% of taxpayers better off wouldn't have proven to be a popular decision from an opposition looking to win government.
It's important to remember too that the Prime Minister's been elected now for just over 18 months. People are paying 27% more tax now than they did when he was first elected.
27% more tax? To be honest, I really don't know where or how Dutton's come up with this figure, and it's not for lack of trying. To be clear, the tax rate hasn't changed since 2020. Okay, maybe he's talking about the low and middle income tax offsets that ended on the 30th of June 2022.
They abolished the Limedo and the support that we had in place.
So at best, he's been highly disingenuous here. Labor didn't abolish the LMITO, they just didn't extend it. And had the Coalition won the 2022 election, guess what? They had not planned on extending it either. Why? Because as former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said, the LMITO was never intended to be permanent. The LMITO was introduced by Scott Morrison when he was Treasurer in 2018 and designed to end in 2022. The LMITO was really just a poor substitute for actual taxation reform. But let's be clear here, the PM hasn't increased taxes.
The Prime Minister made changes which increased taxes for Australians.
Once again, the PM has not increased your income tax. Perhaps Dutton is trying to draw in some other proposed unrelated legislation that would, if passed, apply to those with super balances over $3 million, but who really knows what he's talking about?
We're clear now that we agree that this is good policy and you support it. So therefore the question flows from that. Do you give credit actually to the government for taking a big political risk in breaking a promise in order to help those families?
Well, Sarah, I don't think it's your job to push the position of the government.
It's absolutely not. This is an outside observer saying, is this political courage? Well, I'm going to reject that absolutely. This is a question about whether you, as a political observer, acknowledge there is some courage involved in breaking a promise, incurring all of the criticism that they receive for that and will continue to receive in order to help.
To be fair, that wasn't the greatest line of questioning, but it did reveal that Dutton's not all that quick on his feet. He jumped on the defensive straight away, which really never looks good. And watching it at the time, I was thinking that if Sky News were going to pick up anything from this interview, this would be it.
Bias at the ABC.
Now, I'm sure this next part's not going to be too popular, and I do kind of feel like I'm channeling the spirit of Sky News here, so hear me out. But some things he could have said in response to this question would have been to point out that there was nothing courageous about the government's decision. He could have said it doesn't take courage to make a decision that's likely to prove popular, at least in the short term. It doesn't take courage to make a decision off the back of what you'd have to expect would have been a huge amount of public polling. The government wouldn't have made this call if they didn't know that it would be popular. It doesn't take courage to lie to the Australian people for the better part of 2 years. Courage would have been Labor taking their changes to Stage 3 to the last election. Courage would have been standing up and being honest with Australians. What the government's decision really shows is that they're a government under pressure and making decisions off the back of polling to try and patch up some of their hemorrhaging popularity. See, I said I was channeling the spirit of Sky News.
Ugh, it all feels so dirty.
As the Treasurer pointed out on your own show, they did this with the Dunkley election contest in mind.
Now let's address this in two parts. Part 1, the Treasurer did not say that. I've reviewed the tape. There was exactly one reference to the Dunkley by-election. Here it is.
But also, we needed to legislate the change if we were going to make it. And so we didn't want to wait, frankly, until after the Dunkley by-election. We didn't want to wait until the May budget. We didn't want to leave it too late in the legislative calendar. And so having come up with this better option, better for people, better for the economy, Our responsibility was to explain why we came to a different position and put it into the Parliament as soon as we can, which I'll be doing tomorrow.
And the second part?
I think it's absolutely the case that they've made a political decision.
Let's be honest. All decisions made by government are political decisions. All decisions made by the opposition are political decisions. Now, as much as this may hurt me to say, it's hard to believe that there's not a kernel of truth in this one. You'd have to think Labor and the Libs have both been running polling around the by-election. They'd both have a fair idea where they stand. It's also fair to say that the government and the PM's popularity has been on the slide, so you'd have to be very naive not to think that all those factors ultimately played a part in their decision. Otherwise, maybe all these targeted ads focusing on Labor delivering bigger tax cuts for Dunkley are just a coincidence.
To be clear, what you are doing is you're criticising the government, you're impugning their motives while supporting their tax cut.
100% correct.
Australians, we know under this government, are paying probably about $24,000 a year in after-tax dollars extra because of the 12 interest rate increases. They're also
not within their control.
Well, absolutely within their control, because as the Reserve Bank Governor has pointed out, this is a homegrown problem.
That's taking what the Reserve Bank Governor said a little out of context. In her speech to the annual ABE dinner toward the end of November 2023, Michelle Bullock was talking in the context of the RBA Board's decision made that November.
An important consideration in the Board's decision was that both economic activity and inflation have been a bit more resilient over recent months than expected. Inflation is past its peak and it's heading in the right direction, but it's likely to return to target a bit more slowly than we previously thought. So as such, the Board decided that a rate rise in November at the November meeting was appropriate to be more assured that inflation returns to target in a reasonable time frame and to balance its inflation and full employment objectives. So the minutes of the November meeting were released today and they stepped through the main considerations of that decision. So I'm not going to repeat those.
I'll just pause here for a second. The minutes from that November included the reasons behind the RBA's decision. These included international economic developments, domestic economic conditions, international financial markets and domestic financial markets. Let's continue.
Instead, I want to focus on one particular consideration for policy: that the remaining inflation challenge we're dealing with is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven.
There's a line.
The remaining inflation challenge, outside of the other challenges outlined in the minutes, is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven. There's no one single cause of the inflation problem in Australia. Inflation is the result of multiple different challenges, both domestic and global, supply and demand. Inflation really is a funny thing. When inflation goes up, the political party in opposition at the time will always look to pin blame on the government. When inflation goes up, the political party in opposition will always look to pin blame on the government of the day, whilst the government will say there's very little they could have done. When inflation goes down, the government will be all too happy to take the credit, while the opposition will be out there reminding people that the government did very little to achieve their result. It's a fact that interest rates began to rise in the final days of the coalition government. And let's get real here, there's every chance interest rates would have risen just the same.
And the
not
fact
entirely a homegrown problem.
And the fact that our inflation, well, again, it's not for you to apologise for the government.
I'm not apologising for the government. I'm simply reflecting the views of economists around the world who will acknowledge that we are dealing with a global inflation problem that then adds some domestic elements to it. I'm just stating the case.
Sarah Ferguson wasn't apologising for anyone. She was clarifying the fact that inflation is not entirely a homegrown problem.
But you have said that you will bring a new tax policy to the next election. If you're going to reinstate those tax cuts for wealthier Australians, as you've indicated that you will, the cost for that is $9 billion. How do you propose to pay for that?
Well, again, that's a question put by the Labor Party. So I think, as I pointed out yesterday, and you would have seen
I'm just going to, if I may, I do want to push back against the characterisation that that is a Labor point. The cost of those tax cuts that you're going to reinstate is $9 billion. There's a remarkable
coincidence in the arguments you're putting to the government's arguments.
Well, let's not argue here.
Let's put aside the coincidence.
Let's agree on what we can agree on. The tax cuts have been costed at reinstating those tax cuts comes at a cost of $9 billion.
I mean, come on, man. Dutton himself has said he'll be taking a new tax policy to the next election. The Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, has been quoted as saying that the policy will be in keeping with the Coalition's original plan for Stage 3. And Jane Hume has all but confirmed it without actually committing to anything.
Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor says the tax policy will take to the election as a coalition, his words, will be in keeping with and in line with the principles of the original Stage 3 tax cuts. The big principle was that flat tax rate of 30% for those on incomes between $45,000 and $200,000. Is that something you'd like to see reasserted in that you'd abolish the 37% tax bracket?
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, what Anthony Albanese has done has reinstated that 37% tax bracket.
Absolutely
which
right.
means
Just to be
that,
clear, you are wanting to remove that tax bracket if you win the next election.
Well, that's what simpler taxes are all about.
And Dutton himself has been quoted as saying that this would cost in the order of $9 billion. In my opinion, it's perfectly reasonable to ask a prospective Prime Minister how they'd fund what would be a $9 billion election promise. Dutton's inability to respond to it was telling, but it was his wounded cry for help that stood out even more. It screamed of someone out of their depths, letting out a massive dog whistle, hoping that the Murdoch media would ride in and rescue him from what was a reasonable question.
So let's agree on what we can agree on. The tax cuts have been costed at reinstating those tax cuts comes at a cost of $9 billion. The question is, how do you pay for that?
But again, Sarah, don't misrepresent what I said. I was very clear in the press conference yesterday that we want additional tax cuts because we think that Australians are under significant stress.
No, you haven't been misrepresented here. The opposition have said that they'll do something. That something would cost $9 billion. Asking the opposition leader how they'd pay for that is a legitimate question. Although I suspect that after his embarrassing performance here, the answer might be that if he were PM, he'd find the money by defunding the ABC.
The government's talking about taxes on well, as we know, superannuation. They've already done that in the last budget.
It's true that there are proposed changes to legislation around super tax, but these are to cap tax breaks for people with super account balances over $3 million. It's a topic for a video all of its own, but kinda hard to see why the government would be giving a tax break to people sitting on a super balance of $3 million plus. And it's estimated that this change is only going to impact approximately 80,000 people.
They're talking about changing the negative gearing settings.
No, they haven't. Not that that's stopped Dutton and his gang from talking about it as if it were true though.
They haven't properly ruled out changing the taxation arrangements in relation to the family home, and we don't know what they'll do with trusts and with franked dividends as well. So
this is Dutton dropping a random bunch of items that would no doubt strike fear in the heart of his dwindling boomer base into the conversation with no evidence that they're actually on the agenda. I mean, we don't know what Labor will do if Earth is invaded by a bunch of malevolent aliens tomorrow either.
We are the party of lower taxes.
Not true.
Yeah, Pete, I don't know about that.
Here are the facts.
Charts and graphs here.
Yeah.
Charts, graphs, the works.
Graphs and charts.
We're 52-48 in Newspoll at the moment.
That's an interesting way to word the Newspoll results, Pete. Phrasing it that way may have given people the impression your mob was the 52. Fact. Labor is leading the coalition in the latest Newspoll, Labor 52 to the coalition's 48 on a two-party preferred basis.
Polls in the midst of such a situation.
My numbers have gone up something like 20 points over the last 12 months, which not something that you would acknowledge in this program, but that's the reality.
I'm not sure that that is the reality. 20 points sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? He may be referring to preferred PM, maybe, but I'm not exactly sure where the 20 points comes from. If it is preferred PM, Dutton was on 26% in February 2023 compared to 35% in the Newspoll at the time of this interview. 9% isn't the same as 20%. Maybe he's cherry picking a number from another poll here, I'm really not sure. To be fair, I may well have missed something with this one, so if I've got it wrong, let me know in the comments.
The Prime Minister has a greater net unfavourable number than I do.
I mean, the key here is the term net unfavourable. Now, I stand to be corrected, but I don't believe that that's something that actually exists within Newspoll or polling in Australia more generally. But I'm not a polling expert, so I'm sure I'll be corrected on that one if I'm wrong. But I'm guessing what he's trying to talk about is disapproval rating, in which case, based on the Newspoll results at the time of this interview, yes, it was true, but Albanese's disapproval rating was at 51%, while Dutton was sitting on 50%. 1 percentage point difference. It's hardly worth bragging about. In terms of their approval ratings, Albanese was on 42% to Dutton's 37%. There are a couple of truths to be told here. The first, Albo's net approval rating has absolutely tanked over the last 12 months, and the gap in terms of preferred PM has started to narrow. However, the second truth is, the fact that Albo's ratings have tanked to such a large degree, and yet he still finds himself ahead of Dutton in essentially all of the measures that matter, tells you just how bad Dutton's polling's been for an extended period of time. And this is the point that Sarah Ferguson's tried to make.
In the midst of a cost of living crisis, shouldn't you be leading? We're in the midst of a raging cost of living crisis. Every pollster in the country says it's the one message coming through. Shouldn't you be leading in the polls?
Given everything that's happened in the last 12 months, if things were actually going well for the coalition, shouldn't they be leading in the polls? Perhaps a more accurate statement that Dutton was probably never going to make is that neither the PM or the opposition leader are being viewed all that positively at the moment. As a side note, if you're interested in polling results, two good resources are pollbludgers.net and the opinion polling page on Wikipedia.
It's been a difficult first week for you here. Do you feel also that your political momentum is slipping away?
I just think it's such an ABC perspective, if I might say. All the culture that's so far left within the ABC just seems to permeate through many questions when you go on to a program like this.
Let me ask why you would characterise it in those terms. If we look at the situation, there was widespread agreement.
I think the only journalist that's putting that analysis there, apart from The Guardian, apart from some of the other left-wing online publications, the fact is that we are more united than ever in the Liberal Party.
What I think I found most disappointing about this interview, and there's a lot that's disappointing about Dutton to be fair, was just how heavily he leaned into the right versus left garbage. It was like he'd just received a care package of talking points from Trump's campaign manager in the US. It was disappointing but not surprising. It's the sort of confected crap we can expect between now and the next election. A lot of lamenting the division in Australia on the one hand, while stoking that same division with the other.